Welcome back to Reviews with Elaine, because I have opinions. And today's opinions will be about Black Sun by Rebecca Roanhorse. So I have coveted this book pretty much since it came out. I mean, look at this cover! It's stunning! The contrast of the blue to the gold to the black, the curving lines, the feathery mask. It's just gorgeous! And I never looked up anything about what it was about beyond pre-Columbian fantasy, because I like me some surprises. But in case you are not a weirdo who enjoys blind dates with books, Black Sun takes place in a land called the Meridian, which I do find just fun because I grew up in a city called Meridian. But this Meridian is a collection of city-states situated around a crescent sea. The most powerful city is Tova, where the Sun Priest divines the future of peoples and communities from the sun and the stars. The priests don't technically rule the city, but they have a lot of power and choose the matrons of the Sky-Made clans who do rule the city. People from all over the Meridian are required to send their children to learn with the priests, but not everyone is happy under the Sun Priest's reign. There are the poor who live in the maw, separated from the rest of the city, unable to rise any higher because of their birth. There are other cities who wish to buck off the power of Tova, and even one of the Sky-Made clans in Tova, Carrion Crow. Many in Carrion Crow never gave up the belief in their old crow god, and a generation ago, the Sun Priest sent his knives, his assassin priests, to destroy the power of the cultists by murdering people throughout the entire district. Dozens, maybe hundreds died, and Carrion Crow has never forgotten. Now, an eclipse is coming, and with it the threat of a god who comes for vengeance, no matter what cost. And this book, in my opinion, is a masterpiece in balance. It has a truly beautiful mix of violence and kindness, cruelty and tenderness, beauty and coarseness, tragedy and hope. It does a spectacular job of giving us characters with motivations that seem outside of a modern worldview, but are also intensely familiar. Serapio is such a fascinatingly drawn character. He is pretty with thick, curly dark hair and elegant hands, but also horrific with his red-stained teeth and scars. And I do love the fact that it's set up pretty early on. We see that people in this world, it's not just like an outsider point of view, people within the world also find these elements of his appearance a bit horrific. But as they get to know him, they start to see the beauty in even this. But also, more than his looks, the actual character himself is a really well-balanced character. He's the type of person that I would not usually like as a character. He can be intensely callous and violent and cruel. He is perfectly happy to sacrifice his entire existence to fulfill his mother's dream of murderous revenge, which is not a kind of self-sacrificing that I tend to like in a character. But at the same time, he's not unlikable. Honestly, I sort of love him, partially because he is also kind, gentle, and childlike. The curiosity and simple companionship he shows to Shiala is incredibly endearing. And I know that part of what makes this particular character work so well is that we are introduced to the more endearing parts of him, his love and care and the gentleness he shows with his crows, long before we see the more scary sides of him. It's an easy, simple way of getting us on his side before the book ever asks us to question the morals of his actions. But the thing is, this does not always work. I have read plenty of books that tried to set up a character as likable by only showing me his good sides, and they lose me the first time he does something morally questionable. But it did work here. Every time we see him doing something horrific, we see him being gentle and kind and intensely human, either immediately after or before or both. And it just comes across as beautifully well balanced. It's also well balanced on both sides of the conflict. This is one of those books that there are POV characters on both sides of the central conflict, and a central conflict that is basically going to be a war. And on both sides are likable POV characters that you want to side with. On the side of the Sun Priest, we have a Naranpa, who is basically a cinnamon roll. She is kind, she is loving, all she wants in life is good things, And the only time that she is annoying is when she is utterly failing to notice how much danger she is in. But, though, honestly, that's not even fair. Like, that's not really what's happening. It's not me being annoyed at her for being oblivious. Because, like, there are those characters who are just all light and joy and are completely ignoring the darking, looming shadows right behind them. I'm thinking of, like, you know, the Sultan in Aladdin, who is just sitting there happily playing with his toys while his evil vizier is laughing manically behind him. Nara, on the other hand, no, she does know who her enemies are. She just doesn't realize quickly enough how dangerous they are. And it's a bit infuriating to read from her point of view because she gets boxed in by events very early on. She knows at least some of what's going on pretty much within the first couple of chapters, but there's nothing she can do about any of it. And almost everything she does try to do backfires. And it just ends up being a bit infuriating to read, especially considering of all the characters in the book, she has what are honestly what most people would consider the purest motivations. Like, yes, she is seeking more power for the priesthood, but she's doing so specifically to try to help the poor. I already talked a bit about how amazingly likable Serapio is, but even many of the secondary characters who I sort of knew from the moment they were introduced were going to be antagonists were still likable. I liked Callow, even though he was a bit callow. Iktan is one of my favorite characters in the book, and I love the fact that the book ends with us unsure what side Z is on. Okoa is pretty likable, and he is one that I actively did not want to like, because he was introduced late enough in the book that I already knew when I met him that he was going to be on the opposite side of the conflict from Nara. And, you know, it's emotionally stressful to be attached to people on each side of a conflict, people who are each other's enemies. But he was just clearly trying so hard just to do his best, and was being led around by events so thoroughly that all I felt for him was compassion and pity. And that made me want to see the best happen for him, even though what's best for him might be in direct contrast of what's best for many of the other characters. And there are lovely moments throughout the entire book that you see the characters sort of coming together and just want them to sit down and talk, because you're like, oh my god, if y'all just met each other, I'm sure you'd be on the same side. But events and destiny are not letting them do so. And there's one of the major themes of this book. It's a pretty common epic fantasy trope. Characters are dragged into the role of hero or villain by prophecy, gods, and events they have little to no control over. Like, honestly, that is one of the major building blocks of the genre of fantasy. And because of that, it's a trope that gets a lot of deconstruction and a lot of flipping on its head. But this is a book that plays the trope straight and evaluates it. But not in such a way that it would take me out of the book. The characters here are self-aware of the trap of destiny they are in. Some of them are content with the trap, and some of them are very decidedly not content. But all of their musings, all of their, like, upsetness, all of their joy, it reads as part of the story. Like real people who are really addressing the way their own story is not under their own control. It doesn't feel like the author's just like pausing the book to deconstruct a trope for a minute. It provides a really interesting personal conflict with characters that are aware that they have little to no control over events, but still desperately trying to use what power they have to make things better. And it took what is usually a really fantastical trope and brought it back down to the real world, to real people. Much of Nara's journey of having these great plans only to see them crumble at her feet when bigger events sort of roll over her. Yeah, I feel like that's something most people can relate to. I feel like this book also did a pretty good job of walking the line between inevitability and hopelessness. We're told pretty early on how these people's lives are going to fall apart. Not always directly, like there are some things that are a little bit more just implied, but you have a strong idea of what's going to happen. And yet it still felt like a surprise in the end. And part of that is how the foreshadowing and foreboding works in this book. It's not dropped on you in one heavy chunk. It's slowly meted out, gently, subtly. so that it felt more like you settled, the idea of what was happening settled into your heart well before it settled into your mind. And to me that's very important, because when my brain knows exactly what's happening in a book, what's going to happen, I see no point in reading on. It makes me depressed. I don't want to read any more of it. But when I just got the vibes, there's still the hopes that it could turn out differently. I'm going to still want to keep reading. But all of that is not to say I think this book is somehow perfect. I feel like the relationship between Shiala and Serapio was lovely, gently building until we got to the last arc of their relationship, and suddenly it felt like a whole lot of telling and not much showing. Now, I've seen some writers that take the whole rule of show don't tell as like the word of God. And like I've seen authors critique each other just by being like, oh, you're telling, you can't do that, always show. And I disagree with that. There definitely are places and times to just fucking tell your readers. Like, I don't always need you to paint out every physical response your character's body is going through to demonstrate that they are getting tired. You can just say, John was tired. But there are also times that telling makes your story feel disconnected and lacking in depth. And when we get to the point that we are just told that Shiala cried, begged, and berated Serapio about his choice, rather than actually hearing her words, it felt disconnected. Especially considering their relationship developed very quickly, and Shiala is a character that is presented as very guarded, and the type to go to anger rather than sadness, up until that exact point. Her responses end up feeling abrupt and almost unearned. To me, it undercut an otherwise really touching part of the book. And sometimes the word choice took me out of the narrative. This is written in what I think of as low fantasy tone. It reads a good bit like how you would expect a modern American to speak. It's not overly poetic, though it does have poetic moments. It's not really trying to capture an archaic voice. If anything, much of the prose is poetic in its simplicity. And that's a tone that, honestly, I prefer in most of my fantasy. While I love a good high fantasy written with purple prose, complex syntax, unusual and advanced word choices, nothing vaguely modern, so that you feel like you are reading something from the 1600s, that's all fun. But overall, 9 times out of 10, I'm looking for the books where the prose doesn't get in the way of the story, where it sounds like someone is telling me a story. And I'd say mostly this book balances the exotic, fantastical, and poetic language inherent in building a fantasy world with the more readable, prosaic tone. And it's a difficult line to walk, especially when you have a book that is set in something that is related to a real historical time. This world is clearly inspired by pre-Columbian Central America, so pre-1492. And some words just took me out of that. And the thing is, it's weird and personal which words will feel out of place and bother you and which ones won't. An example from my own writing, I have a book that is set in a fantasy world that is vaguely resembling medieval-ish times, and in it I use the phrase, run interference. And I didn't think anything of it. I wrote it, I edited like 4 drafts, never thought a word about it until the most recent edit. Because it's a common phrase, it's used a lot. But it's actually a very modern phrase. It comes from football, of all things. So yeah, I would not be surprised if someone else who was hyper-aware of the origin of that phrase felt like it was an anachronism. But it doesn't bother me. I can imagine that that phrase has different etymology, but a similar meaning in my imaginary world. Other phrases, not so much. And there were just a few words and phrases in this book that felt that kind of anachronistic to me. Some of them were stupid things to feel that way about, but I cannot deny they threw me off. For example, the language used to describe Nera's mob boss brother. The language just put me in the mind of mafia movies and offers you can't refuse. And even though I fully believe that there probably were crime bosses running casinos in pre-Columbian cities, the images that popped up in my mind made me wish she had just used words that sounded vaguely Aztec, Incan, or Mayan instead of using more recognizable English words. But that is one that, honestly, your mileage may vary. I do not know if that's going to bother you the way it bothered me. And the last thing is something that is less something wrong with the book as something that just is annoying me in the present tense. There are two types of books that have sequels. Those that when you finish, you're like, yep, that was a good book. Like, yep, I'm done with it. It's concluded. I'm done. I'll get the sequel when it comes out, but I don't really care about that right now. And then there's the type when you're like, ah, you can't end there. Like, what the fuck happens next? This is the second kind. Yes, there is something conclusion-y at the end. We know where all our leads are. All of them have had an arc, and all of them are at something of a plateau in that arc. But I once mentioned there was a book that I read that ended feeling like a roller coaster hanging over the edge of a drop. This book feels a bit like we went down that drop, and the book ends as the car is hitting the bottom of the hill at full speed. This is the rare occasion that if I owned the second book, I would probably already be reading it. Though, weirdly, because I do not own it, and therefore cannot pick it up immediately, I think I'm gonna take a good long break before I buy the next one. This book ends in a really heavy place, and though I have a good amount of hope that the series will have a generally happy ending, I know we're gonna go through some heavy shit before we get there. So I'm taking a break. I'm reading something else. But overall, I'd say this book does live up to its absolutely stunningly gorgeous cover.